Hello everyone, I have two guests on the show today. The first is Randy Walsh. He came on last year to discuss his book series, The Apollo Moon Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. Randy returns to the show today and is joined by a long-time critic of his work, Justin Cox. Justin is an engineer and amateur astronomer who doesn't think the case for the faked moon landings adds up. This recording is an informal discussion, or debate, between the two of them. I start out by asking Randy to recap how he became involved in this area.
So, just to give a little brief background, most of you, or some of you anyway, will know I've talked about this before. So, long story short, I actually remember, I'm old enough to remember watching Apollo 11 liftoff from Cape Canaveral in school. So, I grew up with this, and it was a sort of an inspiring moment for me. And I think for a lot of people back then, for millions of people around the world. So I really had no issue in terms of doubting the Apollo missions. That didn't happen until a lot later in my life. And that moment came about, I would say, about 25 years ago. And what happened was I came home and I turned on the TV. I think it was A&E or something like that 25 years ago. And it was a long day at work. And I remember just walking back and forth and listening to the astronauts. They just happened to be talking about Apollo 13. So they were talking about the incident that happened, of course, on the way to the moon, and then how they had to get back. And it was something that really stood out in my mind, and that was their method of navigation. And I remember at that time, I had already had a pilot's license, so I was familiar with navigation, quite familiar with it actually. And I've actually did some studying on it too in terms of celestial navigation. So it's something that's kind of required when, at least 25 years ago, when you were studying to be a pilot. So I really had an issue with that, and it really kind of bothered me, and I sort of just pushed it aside. And I'm not going to get into the details of it right now. We can get into that later. But I remember it was the navigating part that really sort of raised the red flag for me. So about several years later, of course, then we're moving into the 2000s, and that's when the internet was really picking up, and the advent of YouTube, so on and so forth. And I started looking into this a little bit more. And of course, that's when all the conspiracy videos were coming out, Bart Sabril's famous documentary, which I believe was aired on Fox News. And then you had a lot of other documentaries, including, many interviews with Bill Casey, who many consider the father of the Apollo moon hoax. And he incidentally actually published the first book on this back in 1976. So, I found it very intriguing, and that's all well and good. But I thought, no, 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 I've got to look at both sides of this. So I had decided that yeah, the videos are good, the conspiracies are good, they're making a good point. Some of them are a little too far fetched, but overall, they were making a good point. And I thought, okay, I got to pursue this a little deeper. So I needed to start reading NASA's version of this. I need to jump into their documents and start reading books that were written in support of the Apollo missions. And it just took off from there. And so basically, I spent several years researching this. And I think it was about maybe 5, 10 years later when I decided I'd write my first book, which I did. And I published my first book back in 2018. And about 3 years after that, then I published my second book. And since then, I've sort of gotten away from the Apollo missions a little bit. I'm actually investigating other areas now, but researching that is. But then I decided I got a call from a friend of mine in California, and she asked me would I be interested in writing another book on the Apollo missions, and she actually wanted to do it in fiction format. So my first two books are nonfiction, and in fiction format, and I hesitated because the reason I hesitated is because I have never written fiction before. And fiction, for those of you who don't know, and those of you who do know actually, is very difficult because that involves coming up with characters and developing the characters. But she convinced me that that was a very good way to put forward some of your ideas in fiction form, and you can elaborate further. So we did that, and we published the book, and it was just published this month, and it just came out, and it was quite an experience because it gave me the opportunity to express a lot of what I really couldn't express in the first two books. I've sourced all the material in the first two books, and I think those who've looked at the book, I'm not sure if Justin looked at the book, but I know he's made reference to the source material himself. So, you know, that's all sourced. And I look at this book in fiction in term, it's a culmination of my first two books. So that's really how I got involved in this. And it seems like this is an ongoing thing because every year something else comes out, something new comes up, and it's something else to pursue. And right now, I think there are a lot more people than we, let's say, 25, 30 years ago that believe that there's some serious questions that NASA needs to answer in terms of the Apollo moon landings. And a lot of those questions are now being asked online. A lot of people will give the internet credit for that, but I actually think people are just sort of looking um, are taking more of a peripheral view, if I could put it that way, because they're looking at other areas and they're saying, well, okay, you lied about this, and now are you lying about this? And I find that the deeper that people look into this, the more questions that are raised, and I think that's bringing more of an awareness to this subject. And I understand too that talking about this in terms of the Apollo moon hoax is very upsetting to a lot of people. There's an emotional attachment to this, you know, unlike other conspiracies, and let's call it that, I call it that anyway, but there's an emotional attachment to this, and it does seem to trigger people. And I understand that. I really do. And, you know, I don't think any of us are set out to offend anyone, but you also have to go where the research leads you. And that is where the research has led me right now. And I hope I've covered everything. Back over to you there, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Randy. So, Justin, we'll come to you, and maybe you could say whatever you've perhaps prepared to say, and just a bit about how you got into this strange world of, I guess, moon landing hoax debunking, and what brings you here. What convinces you that we did indeed go to the moon? Not we, as in the three of us, but the Apollo astronauts.
I came to the Apollo Detectives. Actually, I think it was called Shill Slayers or something different at the time. It was one of the anniversaries for Apollo 11. Um, I grew up as an avid hobbyist, amateur astronomy and astrophotography, um, and always had an interest in that. My educational background is actually English. I was going to be an English teacher, but prior to Y2K, I went into information technology, and then I've been in that just to try it out. I put my toe in the water. Jobs were plentiful at the time. I have been a network engineer and a systems administrator now for the better part of 30 years. And in the middle of that, I did a 3-year stint with the Advanced Engineering and Sciences division of a kind of a C-tier defense contractor. We worked on a laser communication device with the Air Force Research Lab. So, and my job title then was electro-optical engineer. So, you know, I did astronomy and physics and all that stuff in college, and then I do have some professional experience in that field, but you know, mostly now I sit in front of a computer all day. But um, part of my as being an astronomy hobbyist, I've been involved in the local astronomy club for 20 years. Now, recently, I haven't been as involved, but you know, in my time with the club, I served on the board, spent a lot of time doing outreach in the community for schools and scout groups. You know, constantly setting up at a school or some place for people that wanted to learn about astronomy to come in and ask questions and look through telescopes. And I enjoy the technical part of it as well as the science part of it. I'm no means an expert on any of it, but it's just been a part of my life for most of my life. So I think I got fired up when I found Shill Slayers community, and I felt at the time it was irresponsible to really question the Apollo missions and the NASA and the Apollo program. Unless in detail, you know, you can support whatever claim it is that you're making, and that's really why there have been times where I've walked away from it. And Randy will tell you, like, he and I have butted heads, and goodness gracious, I have a reputation for being kind of a pit bull on this stuff, and I've backed off. Randy and I have got along pretty well over the last couple of years, but goodness knows he and I butted heads before, just in written comments on YouTube videos. But the thing about Randy, and Randy, you can answer this at some point. I lump you in with the rest of the Apollo detectives, Scott and Marcus and expat Taffy and Robert. No, I think Dr. Rasa is involved in this, but I always felt like I set you aside because as someone that it's also, books have been a big part of my life, and I've written bad derivative fiction since I was a child. Never got anything published. I've won some writing contests and that kind of thing, but like I appreciate, even if I don't agree with everything that's in your book, I do appreciate the effort that it takes, just to get the book done, let alone, publishing's tough. And being self-published, there's no shame in that. In fact, it's probably the only hope that I have, if I could ever finish anything that I've started, but of getting it out there. But your books, it's well cited, it's well written. I just, I have questions about some of the things that you've written. And it seems like, at least the Apollo detectives community, like I'm banned. I can't even comment on either of there's the main channel, and then there's a sister channel. Like there's not really any discussion about it. So, I'm here today, and I welcome the opportunity to have a little back and forth, a friendly back and forth about this topic.
Okay, thank you, Justin. So, gentlemen, we've said, just for the audience's sake, I'll say what we said before the recording, which is we're going to keep things quite informal. We have some kind of structure, but we want the structure to help the discussion and not hinder it. And we're going to sort of figure out what the best way to go is as we're going. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, I suppose I'm curious to know, it's an interesting dynamic that there seems to be some sort of level of mutual respect between you and the level of writing, and yet you both feel the other has got this issue dead wrong, just dead wrong in terms of the moon. And that's kind of what intrigues me about this discussion and a lot of others, how people can look at the same thing and see it in completely different ways. It's why I get drawn down these rabbit holes, I suppose. So I wonder, maybe I'd like to ask Justin, in looking at this subject, has there been anything that's made you really think, oh, I don't know about that? Anything in Randy's research about the rocketry or anything else that has made you wake up at 3 a.m. and think, gosh, maybe we didn't go to the moon? And I suppose maybe we'll go to that with Justin first, but then the same to Randy in terms of, have you received any arguments that have at any point made you think, oh no, I've published 2 books on this and I've got it all wrong, that they really did definitely go? So if I pose that question to both of you, maybe Justin first and then Randy, and then maybe we can move into a more kind of direct questioning. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Sure.
I mean, I'll concede, and I've said this before in comments on videos, and I'll say it here vocally to you guys, put it on the record. Like, I can be convinced that it didn't happen. I watched a recent debate that Marcus Allen did on another channel, and he brought up the whole point about the context of the times that the Apollo missions occurred in, and Vietnam and presidential assassinations and all that, and Apollo was a feel-good story in that era. It's like a positive thing where the whole world got behind. And then we had the Cold War, the whole political thing with the Soviets. And I think that you could certainly easily make a case on why we would fake all of it to get that win, and for the positive impact that it had, not just on the country, but worldwide. But I think when you start to dig into the minutia of the engineering and science and stuff, that's where I have yet to see a convincing argument. But I'm not, show me, or let's work through it and look at what Randy often refers to as the official narrative, and even get, if we need to get experts involved. I had reached out to another member of the community, the AD group, about the LRO images of the landing sites. And Arizona State University, a lot of people that work on that program are available. We can email them and ask questions and ask for explanations. And it never happened, but it would be interesting, even with Randy, to kind of take a deep dive on some of the specific points that give him pause when considering the validity of the Apollo program.
Okay, that's an interesting answer, Justin, because in some ways that's kind of where I'm at. The context of the times makes me think, hey, it's reasonable to question this. The amount of stuff that was going on with the Vietnam War and the Phoenix program and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the presidential assassinations. Yeah, of course, it's reasonable to think, compared to getting the US embroiled in that war in Southeast Asia, what's faking a little moon landing compared to that? It's a tiny thing. But the technicalities, well, that has to be answered too. So, Randy, over to you. What is this? What's your cold sweat moment where you think you might have gotten it all wrong? Do you have one, or are you completely confident at all points? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank Justin for his contrition there. We did have some moments back and forth where we were on a level playing field. And he did actually relate to me that he actually didn't relate to me. I actually saw his comment to somebody else where he actually complimented me on my book. It was put together. He didn't necessarily agree with it, but nonetheless, and I can appreciate that. People don't have to agree with me. I'm not asking people to agree with me. I'll get to that in a moment. So I just wanted Justin to know that I certainly appreciated that, that he recognized the work that goes into writing and publishing a book. I saw that debate with Marcus Allen and MC Toon as well, and I had some issues with that debate. It went on far too long. It was 4 hours, but it was actually well worth it. And some of the issues that both had raised some good issues. Marcus really rang with me when he brought in the Apollo missions in terms of its context for that time period. And, I was only, I was like 9 or 10 years old during the Apollo missions. So I didn't experience that context. But for me later on, but I grew up in a world, and this is something I want to emphasize. I grew up in a world where there was one, you call it a conspiracy or you can call it corruption, major government corruption after another. And it does erode your trust in government overall. But I wasn't prepared to make the decision just on that erosion of trust alone. I needed to find out more. I needed to know for myself, if I'm going to put my name on this, if I'm going to put Randy Walsh on this subject and says that this subject is a hoax, then I know what comes with that. And for the last 5 years, I've experienced that. And I don't have any complaints because I knew going in that I would experience that, that huge negative feedback, that backlash. And I understand it. As I said before in my intro, I understand people's emotional attachment to this. I get it. But for me, when I looked into the 4-hour debate between Marcus and MC Toon was good. They talked a lot about the film, the photo and film record. And there's been a lot of discussion about that, but very few people discuss the actual technical aspect of it. And for me, when I jumped into the technical aspect of it, and by the way, I don't consider myself an expert. I'm not an engineer. I do have training in physics, basic physics, like everybody else does in college. Being a pilot and then becoming a commercial pilot didn't make me an expert, but it gave me an idea of what I was in for. It gave me sort of maybe a leg up or an edge into maybe, and if I didn't understand something, then I can research it further in terms of, the Saturn V rocket, the forces that act on that as it's launching, and, the engines, the technical aspects of the engines, solid fuel versus liquid fuel, that kind of thing. It's when I looked into that, it did, I have to admit, it's convinced me. I haven't had that aha moment. Oh, wait a minute, did I make a mistake? Not when I look at the technological aspect of this. The problem with looking at the photographs and the film, they're good and very convincing arguments on both sides. I often wonder, though, if it's a red herring because they can be updated and changed, but not so with the technological aspect. the everybody, the proponents of the Apollo missions, and those against it, myself, you have to own that. You cannot manipulate what has been and what happened. Like, you have to own that. You have to acknowledge, yes, questionable practices, questionable quality control, lack of testing when it came to a lot of components of the Apollo missions. So I have to, in all honesty, as I look into this further and further and further, I'm convinced more and more and more that these missions did not happen.
Okay, thank you, Randy. So I think it might be interesting now if the two of you throw your best shots in terms of, okay, what's the most convincing thing? What's the most damning thing about the other one's argument? And I don't know if there's a logical order to do this in, but as Randy's just spoken, I'll maybe go to Justin and say, over the interactions you've had with Randy, what would be the points that you think he would find really hard to answer and that would really convince you that the moon landings did indeed happen? So yeah, I mean, you can just mention one, Justin, or maybe there's two or three you'd want to put out, and then Randy can respond to that, and then we'll do the same thing for him. Is that okay?
Well, sure, yeah. I have Randy's first book. I bought it years ago. I actually pulled it up on my Kindle reader today and was looking through it. I wish probably should have spent more time. But one of the things um, that one of Randy's interesting arguments against Apollo is his thoughts on testing, and it made me take a deeper look at that. What they were doing, the testing methodologies that NASA had adopted up until George Mueller came in what, 63 or 64, and then they started the all-up testing because he made the case that there's no way we're going to get to the moon by the end of the decade if we don't like ramp things up here. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Randy, but I think that basically you have suggested that what they did wasn't enough, and that it's certainly not up to the standards that exist, in the airline or the aircraft industry. So my question to you is like, how much, I don't know what else they could have done, because the engines were one shot. I mean, Robert Biggs is on record saying that if they could have retrieved them after a launch, they could have reused them. But of course, SpaceX now just drops everything back down on the boat or on a launch pad. But back then, they were just gone. So I had some notes today too, like on how many they had 77 hours of testing, I think, all told on the F1s, for a rocket engine that really was 2.5 minutes of the flight. Just trying to get them up to alpha. I think they were up 40 or 50 miles downrange and at that altitude. And of course, there were problems with led them to come up with the combustion plates, the baffles, and then there was also Pogo, which I think you talked about. So, if you want to, I guess we want to take a deeper dive onto a particular subject, that's one that you've written about that is interesting to me.
Sure. So I actually expanded on this a little bit more in my second book. I was trying to, when you write a book, you look back and you say, okay, I could have expanded a little bit more on that. So I qualified some of what I said in book one in my intro to book two. The issue I have with it, and you're correct, Justin, when you say that the F1 engines had 70 hours of testing. But we need to break that down. When you take a deeper dive on that, okay, so it was about 64 hours of testing on each individual F1 engine. And then the remaining several hours were on the cluster of the 5 engines, which is what you would find in the Saturn V, hence the name Saturn V. Now, that is reasonable. There's no doubt about it. That's a reasonable amount of testing, and probably a little bit more than as some would argue, that was even necessary. However, that's static testing. That is not in-flight testing. They do the same thing with any industry. They do it with cars, they do it with trains, they do it with planes. Is that, yes, you have to have a certain amount of static testing. First of all, you got to make sure the engine's working. So let's just generalize it for a second. You have to make sure the engine's working, but then you have to make sure it's working in let's say in a car, it's working in the vehicle. Let's say in a train, it's working in the train, and of course in aircraft. There has to be a comparable amount of when it comes to aviation and the aerospace industry, there has to be a comparable amount of in-flight testing. However, it's reasonable to say that, well, you can't expect to match the hours, the testing in hours in terms of 70 hours compared to a rocket, a Saturn V, given the cost involved, which is enormous. So that's not what I was really saying. What I was saying is that when I talk about a comparable amount of in-flight testing, 4 minutes doesn't qualify. And that's the total time the F1 engines had in in-flight testing before they put a crew on board the next Saturn V launch. 4 minutes, in my opinion, doesn't qualify. Now, you're right when you say it's a one-shot deal. Once you use these engines, they're finished. But there's also testing to make sure you get consistency out of the engines. And, if they got at least, let's just take a figure out of air and call it, let's say, 5 launches, unmanned launches. And they got consistency with the F1 engines in those 5 launches. That might qualify as comparable testing in terms of the static testing they did. They might want to do a little bit more just to be sure that they maintain that consistency before they put a crew on board. That was not done in the Saturn program. That was not done. In fact, I'll go one step further. The Saturn V, with the testing with the Saturn V, it didn't even match the testing of the Saturn I, which was a far a less powerful rocket, as you know, the Saturn 1B. I think I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it was about 14 launches before they put a crew on board a Saturn 1B. So, and it was different variations of that Saturn 1B, and that's with the far lesser H1 engines that produced about 200,000 pounds of thrust each. So we're talking about, when you add in that the F1 engines, by that time, by the way, the H1 engines that were used in the Saturn 1B have been around for a while. So they've had some experience and some consistencies in terms of those engines, and they worked really well, the same with the J2 engines, although they were having some problems with them as well, which were used in the second and first stage of the Saturn V, but not the issues that we found with the F1 engine. My problem with the F1 engine is that this was the most powerful engine ever built. For those of you who are listening right now, each engine produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust. When you put the 5 engines together, you're looking at 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And that thrust was necessary to launch the 46 tons of hardware into orbit in order for them to be able to travel to the moon and land. So that they needed that thrust. They needed that thrust vector to get that equipment just to get it into orbit. So taking into account that the F1 engines were new territory, very new territory, there's never been a rocket like it since, I don't think 4 minutes of in-flight testing qualifies. And we saw that the in-flight testing was done with Apollo 4 and Apollo 6, 2 unmanned Saturn V launches. And I might add that the second launch, the Apollo 6, was plagued with problems. It had massive problems. And as you actually said yourself, they had to address those problems before they sent up another launch. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm not expecting them to match airline territory, given the expense. When you look at how much this program cost back then, we're looking at least $250 to $300 billion in today's value. So when you break it down, you wouldn't be able to do it. You'd bankrupt the country just trying to do 70 hours of in-flight testing. But I think I'm in good territory when I say they could have at least done more than 4 minutes of in-flight testing to get, in order to get some consistency. Because there's one thing to do static testing when it's, the engine's bolted down and to get it working, and that's all well and good. But now you're dealing with, when you put it in a rocket, you're dealing with forces, atmospheric forces. And those are at play every inch that rocket is climbing through the atmosphere. And that's why I made the conclusion, I came to the conclusion I did, that was just not enough testing, given the fact that one of the unmanned rockets they sent up was almost a disaster. And then they went 7 months from that point, Apollo 6 to Apollo 8, of putting a crew on board without any further testing. As far as I know, there wasn't any further testing, static testing of the F1 engine when they made the modifications, let alone any in-flight testing.
Okay, Randy, I appreciate Justin might want to respond to that, but I think just to save us going down a road where this one question consumes the whole discussion, would you perhaps like to pose your question to Justin now, and then he can have the time to both respond to what you said, and then we're aware that that question is also there. So the question being, what's your most convincing, and that might be it might be what you've just said, but what's the thing that you think Justin would struggle to answer in terms of defending the humans went to the moon?
Well, yeah, you want me to ask Justin that question?
Well, I think we'll just lump them both in together, and then Justin can respond. And
sure.
And yes.
Sure. Well, I guess. Well, should we let Justin respond to my comments first, and then I'll ask, or how do you want to do this?
We can do. I just don't want it, because it could go to response to response to response to response, and I'm just wary of the discussion getting taken into one complete direction. So I thought maybe it would be good if you voice your question now, and then it's there out in the open, and Justin can do both.
Okay, sure. First of all, I mean, we can talk about I'm not an expert, and I'll lead into a question here for Justin. I'm not an expert, and I always shy away for the most part when it comes to the photo and film record of Apollo. And I know that occasionally we've gone back and forth on that. But I got the impression, Justin, after talking to you over the years, and I have given you a lot of credit, because even though we've locked horns, we've always, for the most part, managed to stay civilized with one another. And I know that when we got a little out of hand, we would actually both step back, and we would say, okay, let's take a step back. And I wish I can say that for many others. That doesn't happen. But I got the impression over the years, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you do have some doubts about the Apollo program. I don't think I've ever really heard you express what those doubts are, and I'd be very much interested in hearing what they are.
Well, as far as the photographic record goes, there's discussion on the AD channel about, beer cans and old cars that are covered with concrete, all that stuff. The sea on the rock, I'm out on all that stuff. I won't even acknowledge that as it's kind of like the whole flag waving thing. It's just, as far as if you're trying to make the case of Poe was fake, I think you're barking up the wrong tree with that. Marcus talked about, he always holds up his piece of film, outgassing and all that stuff. That's a real thing, but it doesn't happen immediately as soon as film is exposed to vacuum. So as far as the film thing goes, even if you look at Hexagon and Corona and all that, sure, there have been systems where they've had to pressurize the film, but usually it's when it's duration of months where the film would be exposed to low pressure or vacuum. So there's a paper on Alice, and I forget who wrote it. It's one of the Russian guys, and I think you referenced them in your first book. And it's about I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, Inconel 500. It's some of the materials that they use for the construction of the F1. And I'm not a mechanical engineer. I worked with them when I was doing electro-optical work, and we regularly sent parts out for heat treating and all kinds of stuff, or just the hardware that we were working on. So that's an area that I could probably figure it out, but it's just not something I've ever spent any time on. My brother-in-law is a graduate degree mechanical engineer and a manager for GE aircraft, I think. And, I could probably talk to him about it if I wanted to bother him with it. But I think some of that stuff, like if you look at the specific materials that were used to construct the spacecraft, and then we got barbecue mode and all that, but expansion and contraction, and I think that might be worth diving into if you were really trying to make a case for, like, here's the level of detail where they blew it. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
sure, no, it does.
That's something that I've always wondered about.
Can I
Yeah,
ask
and
sorry, do you
sure,
want to
go ahead.
respond
Yeah.
to that? And I'll ask a question in a minute if you want to say something about that, Randy.
No, it is a point that that I value that in terms of what Justin just made here. I value that point. I have actually sort of carried that line of thinking over into other aspects of the Apollo missions. I've stayed away, as I said earlier, from the photography and film record. There's enough experts out there discussing this. Marcus just did a 4-hour debate with MC Toon on that, so people can refer to that for, you pretty well get all you need to know in that debate. But we don't focus enough on the testing aspect, and there's other components in the Apollo program that are very questionable when it comes to testing. And I have actually put a quote in my book, in my second book, from one of the officials that was involved in the. I'll look up the quote when Justin's talking, but he made reference to the quality control, and as an engineer, he was really involved in the Apollo missions. He was really taken aback by the lack of quality control. That's a very strong statement. Now, people will say that's not a smoking gun, but that's a very strong statement. And when you take a step back and then you take that 40,000-foot view, that statement has even more of an impact to actually say, we achieved the greatest scientific we made the greatest scientific achievement of mankind. And then you have an engineer who's actually involved in the very missions you're talking about that comes along and says, I was really taken aback by the lack of quality control. That's a very loaded statement.
Justin, is it surprising to you that this whole thing worked with as few casualties as it did? Because obviously there were casualties in Apollo 1 right there on the launch pad. But, if I was a betting man in 1965 or whatever, and said, okay, could you pull off these 6 missions to the moon and only one of them will really go wrong at all and the guys will still come home safely and they're going to land this craft on the moon on this surface and they're going to take it off again from there and no one's going to die in this whole process and they're not going to go splat into the moon as they're flying towards it. I wouldn't have bet on that, right? I would have bet no, like there's going to be 100 men die in the effort to go through the vacuum of space and land on orbiting rock, and the idea that they can come home safely again, and not bounce off the atmosphere and go into an eternal orbit around the sun. All of those other possibilities seem far more likely to you. And just to, somewhat acknowledge Randy's point without saying it's necessarily true. Do you have that sense of like a slight incredulity at this? I think, wow, that is really surprising.
Well, I mean, even the guys that went, if you watch any of the documentaries that have the astronauts talk about how unbelievable that it is, and I think that Apollo 13 has been dramatized and sensationalized as like the big catastrophe mission, and the guys came back and survived. But I think if you really go through all the other missions, there were problems constantly of lesser significance, at least relative to what happened on 13. I think that because of the way that they basically rushed everything through, they were trying to hit that. They were trying to beat the Soviets. They were trying to honor the commitment that Kennedy made. That yeah, it was risky. Mueller even said when he had to go toe to toe with Werner von Braun in order to change the testing methodology. And what Mueller, this all up concept wasn't new to Apollo. Like the missile programs and stuff that he had worked on before he came into NASA. It's what they had done and had success with. But he did acknowledge that, this definitely increases the risk. And I think the guys, the pilots, the astronauts rather, who most of whom were test pilots, they were aware of what they were getting into. So I think had the program continued, sure, I think it's possible that they
Right.
could have lost the whole crew. But as far as incredulity that they could have done it at all, that's tough. I mean, I think honestly, like the emotional part of this that Randy talked about, people will come at him or at people who say it was faked or a hoax. I don't know if I'm able to completely set that aside. And um, it's not a pride thing or a national pride thing. It's just um, it's remarkable, but I don't think it's impossible.
Okay, I'd like to put a slightly different question in, just 'cause I think it'll be interesting for the audience if a broader range is covered, whilst acknowledging that the two of you might have certain specialties. And I'd like to just ask you both about the photographic record. Now, Randy, I think this question might be a little bit more challenging for you. So I'd like to, I know, Justin, you just made some comments on how there are certain things, like there's a famous image of a letter C on one of the rocks, and that's held up as proof that the photo was faked. And you're saying that's not even worth talking about. So for me, the photographic record, one thing I find very compelling is when I see in documentaries like American Moon, these tippity top photographers from Italy who are held up as being the best in the world in their craft, saying, "Oh, these are not even the good fakes," and really like laying it on thick about that. You think, well, I'm sure these men know photography, right? And that's very strange. Either photographers, there's a lot of photographers who really don't know what they're looking at when they're looking at a photograph, or the Apollo moon landings are faked. But in interviews I've done, I've seen the people demonstrate the kind of bending of shadow effects, and just like from walking down a street and seeing a tree shadow across a pavement. So I really don't know what to make of that. I really don't. And in other areas, like with the videography, when I interviewed uh, Bart Sabrell, and then I interviewed one of his critics, I might have made a Jem, who made a documentary criticizing him, um, and his a funny thing happened. And I came away thinking, yeah, Bart Sabrell just does not have footage demonstrating that we didn't go to the moon. He's just gotten that completely wrong, and I don't know how he could have gotten it wrong. And Bartabell refused to debate Jem or really interact further on that. Well, let's not say that. He refused to debate Jem, his critic, saying it was about his mind being closed, and I really didn't get that. So, my question, I suppose, to Justin would be: have you seen anything in the photographic record where you think, "Wow, yeah, I just cannot explain that"? And to Randy, I think this might be a slightly more tricky question, Randy, because I on one hand, I really respect that you like stay to the lane that you feel you're strongest in, and don't comment on areas that other people are strong in, like Marcus Allen say. But the fact that you are so heavily invested in this moon landing area, and that you're not really prepared to make a definitive statement about the photographs, indicates to me that the photographic evidence possibly isn't that strong. If you can listen to an associate of Marcus Allen, but not come out there and say, "Oh, definitely, look at this. There's no other way you could explain that." So maybe Randy first. Do you feel that that's a fair characterization? I appreciate I'm being quite pointed there, Randy, and I'm throwing you a bit of a curveball. But um, what is your sort of general opinion of the photographic evidence?
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. Actually like the question, and throw me all the curveballs you want. That's okay. Um, First of all, I respect Marcus Allen. I have the utmost respect for him, and I know I'll sound biased in this, but he is a wealth of information. I have actually did have the opportunity of meeting Marcus Allen back in 2019, and I was on my way through to India, and I had stopped in Britain, and I met up Marcus Allen for dinner, and we talked for 5 hours. It seemed like we talked for a half hour. That's how fast it went, because I was actually passing through, so I was only there for 1 or 2 nights. So, but when it comes to the photo and film record, yeah, I have mixed feelings about it, because I said earlier in this particular discussion that I often think it's a red herring, but because those photos and that film can be updated. I mean, we have incredible technologies when it comes to the photographic ability of anybody. I mean, what they were doing 50 years ago, people are doing on a laptop computer
Mm.
today. So let me speak to that question as from a layperson's point of view. Okay. I don't want to get into, because I will not get into the technical aspect of it. It's not my thing, and I fluff it off. I haven't seen anything that's convincing, because I have eyes and I have my a discernment, and I can think too. I don't have to be an expert and just because an expert says it, whether they say the photos are fake or not fake, is immaterial to me. I can look for myself and I'll make that decision, right? I'll take a little bit of what they're saying, and then I'll make that decision. I value the experts, but I value them when I feel they're right. And I have instincts, and my instinct sometimes tells me that sometimes these experts can be bought off on both sides, right? So it puts the person like myself, when it comes to a lay person like myself, in terms of the photos and the film, in a very different situation, because I feel like I'm standing outside looking in. So I'll use one example. I saw in the video debate with Marcus Allen and MC Toon, who is a proponent of the missions, brought up, and I knew this was coming, it was inevitable. He brought up the experiment that was done on the moon with the dropping the feather and the hammer. And of course, they should drop at the same rate and at the same time, because there's no atmosphere, there's no resistance on the lunar surface. Great. But I've seen that very same experiment done here on Earth, and you get the same results at the same rate, at the same time, with the feather and a hammer. So I just fluff it off. It doesn't mean anything to me because that can be duplicated here. And of course, we have the ability of special effects. But the other aspect of the photo record is something that Justin made reference to a little while ago, and that is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2009. And I've looked at many of the photos of the lunar surface taken from that camera. And again, I'm coming from a layperson's point of view. I don't have photographic technology. So, all you people out there, don't jump on me. I'm just making, this is just an observation on my part. And I see detailed clarity from that LOR of areas that are outside of the Apollo landing sites. But when that same camera is used to take photos of the actual Apollo landings, I see nothing but blurry images. And from a layperson's point of view, getting out of all of the technical stuff, going back and forth, whether you're for or against, I've had many people, myself included, say, well, wait a minute, how come I'm seeing such clarity of that moon mountain, but then when you show me a photo of the Apollo landing site, I see nothing but blurry images. And what's more, and I find it very interesting, that you see the basic outline of the lander. There's no detail on that. You see either 3 legs or you see 4 legs. It's supposed to have 4 legs, but you see sometimes you see 3 legs. But lo and behold, even though you can't see any detail on that particular photo in terms of the Apollo 11 lander, let's just pick that one as an example. You see footprints. How is it that you can see the footprints, but you can't see the detail on the lander? And that's my line of reasoning here. And I'm looking for a duplication of those photos that were produced from other areas of the lunar surface outside of the Apollo landing sites, taken by the same camera from the same orbiter.
Okay, I'll make 2 comments there briefly, if I may, before handing over to Justin. As one's kind of for and one's kind of against. So the for one is, when I interviewed you, Randy, I thought it was interesting. I asked you about what would be like some kind of thing that would falsify your position, and you mentioned one of like a strong thing that could happen that would really be troubling would be if there were photographs of the lunar lander site emerged. And I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, you said that why you didn't think they could just do that or fake them is because they can't guess the erosion that would have taken place had those landers really been there. So I thought that was a very interesting point. And I will just comment, it maybe there's an explanation for this, but it does strike me as bizarre that I can go onto Google Maps now and see the car I had parked outside of my house in 2009 in really good clarity, to the point of, oh yeah, I remember having that car. And as we've sailed past the 50th anniversary of the landings, there are no high resolution photographs of the of any of the sites. That does strike me as very strange. Now, okay, that's the point kind of for the hoax position. And my somewhat against point is the hammer and the feather. I've seen video of that being done on the Earth too. I've never replicated it. I don't know quite how that's the case, that they can drop at the same rate when the feather's in air, but I have seen video of it. I actually imported that video into my movie editor, and I timed the release point. I estimated the height of the drop from getting the astronaut's height, and I timed the drop rate and got my high school physics textbook out and spent quite a long time remembering how to do that, and eventually calculated the gravity to see how much the film would have had to have been slowed down. And lo and behold, I got the rate to be 2.5 times less. So the gravity was moon gravity. I think it's 1.6 meters per second, which would mean the film had been slowed down 2.5 times. Now, I don't know if it's possible to slow down film 2.5 times. When I hear about the film being slowed down, people are usually saying it's slowed down um, to half the rate, and then the astronauts are on wires or something. So I did think that was interesting that if the film was faked, they got the gravity right. They got, and I've seen other things that have been dropped and other objects you can estimate the height that have fallen. Where apparently I've not mapped it myself, but apparently the gravity is correct too. So because I thought the gravity could be a real slam dunk thing, because all you've got to do is find one thing that falls at a rate that is not consistent with moon gravity, and it's going to be very hard to account for that in the we went to the moon hypothesis. So that's my comment on that. And I think, Justin, the original question was, is there anything you've seen in the photographic record that you find really troubling, or do you think it's all kind of really quite explicable? And then any comments you would have on anything that Randy or I have just said there.
I don't have any issue with the photographic record. I mean, as far as the lighting and shadows and stuff, I think, are these the film experts that were in the documentary? I haven't seen it. I've seen other people refer to it. I think I looked into it before, they were like food photographers. And I mean, I've been to Nikon school. I shot on film, even astrophotography before digital became in vogue. So I'm by no means an expert, but like I think that it's a foreign environment, and there's no atmosphere, single light source. The ground's uneven. I think it's pretty easy to explain away a lot of the criticisms that we see of the photos. And I know there's some very detailed write-ups with charts and math that have been done by people that cry foul. I don't know if either of you gentlemen are aware of the company NVIDIA. They're basically they make video cards for engineering machines and for gaming, and you know they're experts on how light interacts and can exactly recreate that environment. And they did a thing to kind of to bust the whole. There's the famous picture that Neil took of Buzz coming down the ladder, where Buzz appears to be more brightly lit than he should be, and they did a whole big video where they're basically blowing that argument up. So no, I haven't really seen anything. It'd be super cool to have like a long conversation with Marcus. I know that um, he gets hit a lot for his the thing he did with the British Interplanetary Society, where he did say that he felt that we actually went there based on his examination of the photographic record and also the LRO images. And then, he's since time goes on, people change their mind, people get more information, that's fine. But, um, 2009, when we took I worked with them, when they took the images of the landing sites, I think that was incidental. I mean, the LRO was not sent to the moon to validate Apollo. It had science missions, and then they were also able to do this. And I think in 2012, they hit them again at lower altitude, and those pictures are clear. You'll notice too. I don't know if you've seen it on NASA's website. They have these landing site images, and there's a slider that you can move left and right, and basically it changes the sun angle, where they've taken photos of these sites where the sun's at a different position in the sky. There are some where the footprints disappear depending on the angle of the sun, and then the shadows on the lander become more evident. You can actually see the shadows of all the legs, and then there are others where the footprints and the LSEP stuff is more visible. So it just depends on altitude and also the position of the sun, the angle at which the light's coming in. And then, China's on record. Rasa did an interview too, or a debate recently, where he did acknowledge that China had publicly said that they had, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Chang'e 2 lunar hardware, or that signs of Apollo on the lunar surface. Most recently, India, Israel had some like much more detailed photos of, I forget which site it was or sites. Um, Japan has also confirmed. So there's all that. I don't know. I feel like I've been talking too long, but yeah.
Well,
So the
that's great.
photographic record and is there's nothing in it that would convince me that Apollo didn't happen.
Okay, gentlemen, we're not a million miles off being on for an hour. So, I mean, I'm happy to go on longer, but I'd always prefer to come back at a later point and talk more too. So, open it up and say what's on your minds that you would really want to put to each other, or statements you'd like to make. Randy, perhaps I'll come to you first on that. What have you come into this as anything that you feel is important to say that you haven't said yet that you'd like to now?
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of I'd like to respond to a couple of comments that Justin had just made, if I may.
Hmm.
Um, You see, this getting back to the photo and film record, as I said earlier, it's a red herring because he just made a very interesting comment there that you can adjust the lighting on your laptop in terms of the photos. And you see, this is what I'm talking about is that it can be manipulated. It can be manipulated. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying it can be.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to remember that the LRO, an expensive piece of machinery, we didn't go there to photograph the moon. Why not? I mean, why not photograph the landing sites? This is again, we go back to what we've been constantly told time and time again that this is man's greatest scientific achievement. We have a right to see a little more detail. And why wouldn't NASA spend an extra few dollars of the $20 billion they're getting a year still on, focusing in on those landing sites and giving us a better view? Hell, I got a better one. How about putting a live cam right next to the lander of 9/11, like they did, like they had, or no, no, pardon that, Apollo 11. There's a Freudian, Apollo 11. Uh,
We'll do
so
9/11
like
next
they,
week, okay?
yeah. So like they did with the JFK assassination, they have a live cam right there in Dealey Plaza, right on the sixth floor, overlooking the assassination site. I don't know why anybody wants to look in on that. I visited that site, but nonetheless, they have a camera there. And there's all kinds of other questions like why couldn't we do that on Apollo 11? Apollo 11 is the flagship, right? It's the one mission that everybody thinks about. And there was one more point I do want to make before I moved on is uh, with all due respect, of course, to what Justin is saying, we tend to forget that back then and maybe even today, the U.S. military had the largest, most sophisticated movie studios in the world that even surpassed Hollywood. And a lot of the technology that they were using then is still classified. Photographic technology is still classified to this day. So we don't know what their capabilities are. I was actually impressed that they were 50 years ago able to duplicate not only zero gravity in planes to train astronauts, they were actually able to duplicate 1/6 gravity as well. I didn't know that until I researched my book. So you see, it can go back and forth, and there's a counterpoint to every point that's raised. That's my point here when it comes to the photo and film record.
Justin, anything you'd like to say, respond to questions for Randy, anything you've come in thinking you really want to say and haven't said yet?
Well, just very quickly on the testing for the F1, just one thing here real quick. Let me find it again. There's that paper, Rainey. Have you seen the Remembering the Giants PDF from I forget what year it was they had that, but Robert Biggs spoke about the F1 and he had a PowerPoint slideshow up and it shows that the last engine test for the F1 was April 1st of 73. So I know that they had increased the the amount of weight that I think it lift, especially like for Skylab and for the J missions later on. So anyway, just throwing that out there. Um, I mean, if we're running low on time, I really just want to say I'm grateful for the opportunity to finally get to talk to Randy and Richard. I think you've been terrific. It's been actually been fun. Time went by really fast. I wouldn't mind doing it again if it's worth having me be part of it. But um, to Randy's final point there about it almost comes down to a he said, she said sort of thing. And certainly there are reasons why they would have fabricated it, given all the stuff that we talked about earlier. Um, and I just haven't seen anything yet, but doesn't mean it's not out there.
Okay, gentlemen. Well, thank you very much. I feel good wrapping up there if the two of you do. And we'll put this out there and see what feedback people have and where we could potentially take a further dialogue in the future. So, uh, are we good with that? Is there anything we're missing or?
No, I like that. I think we've gone on for about an hour, 20 minutes, maybe, or maybe an hour, 5 minutes, actually. It
Yeah.
did go fast.
Okay.
I wasn't expecting it to go. Yeah, it went really fast. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. We haven't even scratched the surface. And so I do appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion or debate, whatever you want to call it, with you as a moderator and of course with Justin. So I definitely appreciate that. I am, it's kind of nice when the two opposing views who are civilized with each other come on here and have a really good discussion. And one of my criticisms with the debate that we saw with Marcus Allen and MC Toon is just the abuse that went on there from one side. I'll try to be fair here. I won't name names, but there was a fair amount of abuse, and I don't like that. If that happens, I end the debate. I will not discuss anything with anybody who gets into that level of abuse. And I really appreciate Justin. I appreciate your comments today. I appreciate the frank discussion we have, and I would look forward to doing it again.
Yeah, thank you. Nobody looks good when they do that kind of thing. So yeah, I appreciate the civility and reflections you've both brought today. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And I look forward to doing this again. Thank you.
Yes, I do too.
See you guys. Thanks.